And one of the things that I said that got everybody's attention, which I fear is true, is that the average housewife in India has more gold now. I mean, collectively, if you got all the housewives in India together, they have more gold than the Bank of England. And I think what we're going to find in London and in New York, that much of the gold that we assume is there is not there. And it's not just Fort Knox. I mean, Fort Knox is one repository. There's a lot of gold under the streets of New York. And we don't know what has happened because the people that have been in charge of the Fed have really operated without effective oversight. And it may turn out that most of it is there. I hope so. There are all sorts of shady deals behind the scenes that have been going on for decades. This is what Dr. Ron Paul has talked about for years. That's why when he was a member of Congress, he wanted to audit the thing. And of course, everybody just laughed at him. I don't think people are laughing anymore. I think you've got a problem. We have a problem. We need to find out what it is, because if you look at where the gold is accumulating, well, that's obvious. Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. It's been migrating into those countries. Why are they hoarding gold? And at the end of the day, what good is our fiat currency if it's not backed by something substantive? People complain about BRICS, but at least if you join BRICS, you know that it's going to be backed by gold, the currency. So your trades are meaningful, and they're working hard to develop that. What are we going to do? I don't know, but I'm very worried. But I know that the German Republic, the Federal Republic, asked to have its gold repatriated to Berlin. Well, they only got 40% of what we held. Where's the rest of it? And Merkel shut up about it. She didn't complain anymore. Suddenly, okay, 40% is enough. Where's the other 60% of the gold that we owe the Germans that is supposedly in New York? I don't think the monster of globalism is going to win anything. I think it's probably going to die quickly. The problem for us, of course, as you know, is the financial system. And we're in a lot of trouble in the United States. We have this national sovereign debt that has reached monstrous proportions. There is no plan to deal with it. That's another issue. I know that privately, both when he was president and when he was running for president the first time, President Trump brought this up and was told by everybody, oh, don't mention that. Don't mention that. Don't mention that. That's problematic. Well, here we are. People have, refused to mention it. We are now trying to find evidence for all sorts of waste, fraud, and abuse and spending in Washington. Well, that's easy. You can find that all over the place. We can't even audit the $1 trillion Pentagon budget. Nobody knows where all the money goes. We haven't even talked about the intelligence organizations. And you had a similar crisis that ultimately helped to bring down Liz Truss, because she walked in and said, I'm going to be the new Margaret Thatcher. I think a lot of people said, well, Trump's going to come in and be the new Ronald Reagan. Can't do it. This is, an entirely different world. He's finding his way through this. He's appointed people to deal with it, which is a very positive thing. But the problem is they'll never harvest enough savings to make any difference to this gargantuan debt, unless you go after entitlements and other things, and then you can demonstrate to your creditors that you're serious. I mean, you're in a very similar position, and we have to watch carefully. We call them treasury bonds. You call them gilts. Watch those markets, because that's the real barometer. And as that percentage on our U.S. Treasury reaches 5%, when it hits that 5% ceiling, all bets are off, because we can't service the debt any longer. I think the second part of this that's very important for us to understand is that we've been running on fumes for a long time. You said something that's very accurate. We are bankrupt. We were actually bankrupt when Nixon went off the gold standard. And his objective then was to do it temporarily. And like so many other things in Washington, what begins as a temporary expedient ultimately becomes a permanent feature of government. So that's the other problem. So, we are bankrupt. And as I try to point out to people, when did the British leave India? When the GDP was 240% GDP ratio. The ratio of GDP was 240% of national income in Britain. And, at that point, it was unsustainable. The British left when they were broke. They had to go. Well, we're pretty close to being broke right now. And that's why I think you're finally beginning to hear serious talks about us withdrawing and pulling out of places, because everything with us is mortgaged to vanity, just as it was at the end of the British Empire. Everybody liked to look at the empire and congratulate themselves on how great they were. They fought all through the Second World War ostensibly to retain the empire, and what happened? They lost everything. Now, that's another problem. Well, there are two things to consider. First of all, John Kenneth Galbraith, a brilliant economist who served presidents from FDR all the way through to Carter. He once said that forecasting exists to make astrology look professional. So in other words, write off whatever the economists are telling you most of the time. They have no more idea what's going to happen than the man who's trying to sell you stock in the stock market. He really doesn't know what's going to go up or down and doesn't really understand how it works either. He's just trying to make money. So that's the first thing. But that's where we are, I think, at this stage of the game. And I think privately, President Trump probably understands that. And for him, and I feel badly about this, I'm very worried about what can happen over the next 6 months in the economy and with the financial system, because he happens to be president now. And just like Herbert Hoover had nothing to do with the Depression at all, he just happened to be president. And he became the target of abuse for everybody. I worry that that could happen to Donald Trump. Right now, we have a kind of honeymoon here where everybody is happy and cheering on Donald Trump. And I certainly do. I'm glad he's doing what he's doing. But I do worry about what's coming in the future. And I do think you are going to go down ahead of us. And don't forget, the dollar has an enormous importance in Europe. So what happens in Great Britain, what happens in Europe is going to come to us. In other words, we're all on this sinking ship, if you will, together. Essentially, you declare national bankruptcy and try to start over. The problem is that you're not going to find very many people anywhere that want to lend you any money for a while because your credit rating is going to be in the toilet. That's what we're going to face as well. We will recover. You will recover. But these are going to be hard times. Somebody is going to have to stand up and say that they have nothing to promise by blood, sweat, and tears, but blood, sweat, and tears, at least in the interim, and tell the truth. Nobody wants to hear the truth. And this is another danger that no one wanted to face up to. In 1929, after our market crashed, Herbert Hoover made the decision to deport 9 million Mexicans. Now, did he do that because he was an evil racist? Of course not. Hoover was a Quaker, just like I am, and was the last thing on his mind. But he said, if I don't move these people out of the country, eventually Americans will attack them because they're holding jobs that Americans will need to do. In other words, you've heard this expression, well, they're here because Americans won't do the job, or they're here because Englishmen won't take the job or something. Well, that's going to go away. When times get hard, everybody is going to look for income any way they can get it. And so then you have this horrible divide that exists between those of us who are who we are, we're Americans, or in your case, are British, and those who aren't. I mean, this is something everybody knew could happen. Nobody wanted to face it. The other aspect of this that affects you and us, we've got to send most of these illegals that are in our country that we did not really want in our country, that were forced on us by President Biden and his administration. We've got to send them home. I mean, people don't understand how many billions of dollars we spend on illegals who are inside the country in terms of their health care, their education, their feeding, subsidies, and so forth. You're in a similar position. How can you maintain all of these people? Those things are going to combine with what you're discussing to create an even worse situation. So it's a combination of you're not me, you don't live here, this is not your country, and, oh, by the way, you're a criminal. Whether or not they are, that's the other problem. And in our case, it's also inextricably intertwined, unfortunately, with criminality, because we suffer from this massive influx of drugs and illegal human trafficking. And somebody told me the other day that he said, Doug, you have no idea about the numbers of children that disappear every year in the United States that head south, and then the numbers of children that come across the border and head north. It's going to be ugly. There's no question about it. There's going to be violence. It's going to be one of these cases where people ask the question in Peoria or some other small town in New York or Illinois and say, no, wait a minute. I know who I am. I'm an American. What are you doing here? Why are we subsidizing you? Why are you here? It's going to come down to that sort of thing. Doug, we're getting closer and closer with each passing day to Brazil, to some sort of country like that, where the rule of law is weakened to the point of being almost non-existent, You can't enforce it. Corruption's everywhere. People don't care. Go on and on and on. Mexico is an organized crime state. We can't fix that. I hear people all the time, well, we have to fix it. We can't fix that. Mexico has problems that are just too great for us to handle, but we can close our border to it. We can secure our borders, our harbors, our ports. We can get control of our population, find out who's here, and so forth. I think it has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, we never really hold anybody accountable for the disaster. We simply say, well, that didn't work, pack it up and go away. I remember in the 1970s when I was a young officer, and even before that when I was a cadet at West Point, all the people that instructed us and taught us were veterans who had fought in Vietnam, had 2 or 3 tours there. And they all basically said the same thing. We don't ever want to do this again. We didn't know what we were doing when we were there. It was a terrible waste. Thank God this is over. This should never happen again. Well, to my shock and surprise, we repeated the whole process. And we went into so many countries where we had no business going. And of course, the worst example was Iraq. And we think, at least 2 million people were displaced. Some estimates 800,000 to 1 million were killed. The whole Christian community, the oldest Christian community in the world, in Iraq and Syria, has been largely destroyed. We went in there and did irreparable harm, and that has contributed absolutely without question to the migrations north. All of this is bound up together. There is no easy solution. Cutting the Gordian knot is going to be painful, but it's going to come down to a question. Do we want to survive? Does the American Republic want to survive? Do its people, the people that call themselves Americans, are we going to fight for this republic, or are we going to let it die? Are we going to let it become something else? I hear from people all the time.
So there's good reason to send them away. We need new, fresh eyes to look at a new world, new situations, new technologies, and frankly, to build new armed forces, not rebuild the old ones. The biggest mistake we can make at this point is rebuild the old force. The old force is the wrong force. We need to build a new one. So putting new officers in there is important for that reason, as well as the political reason that why would you want someone serving under you who's supposed to obey your orders, who is ostensibly opposed to you fundamentally, viscerally in their thinking? It's catastrophic. First of all of these senior officers have come up through the ranks, certainly from the mid-90s until now. That was a very different atmosphere in professional terms from what existed before 1991. Now, I'm not saying that all the senior officers today are much worse or less capable or less competent than the officers that existed before 1991, but I don't think there was any highly politicized faction of any kind inside the senior ranks of the armed forces before Desert Storm. That changes in the 1990s because the Clinton administration and subsequently the George W. Bush administration, which was really in most cases an extension of what happened under Clinton, and then Obama, who was really an extension of what was going on under Bush, positioned officers who were user-friendly to the political regimes. And that meant that they were going to support and implement policies which, frankly, most of the officers that were there before 1991 would have viewed as antithetical to the interests of good discipline, cohesion, and effectiveness. Remember, the mission statement that describes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs' true role in all of these matters is as the senior military advisor to the president. The chairman has no real command authority of any kind. The command authority reaches from the president and the secretary of defense down to the regional unified commanders or the functional and unified commanders. It does not go through the service chiefs. Service chiefs are literally a committee of men and women who are part of the advisory staff for the chairman. They have very limited authority when it comes to operations. Unfortunately, most of the chairmen through most of our history have been very unimpressive men, people that were likely to be user-friendly in the wrong way. We haven't had very many who stood up and said, don't do X, it's a bad idea. Very few have done that. So none of these people are in the operational chain of command, but they control most of the money. And when you control most of the money, you control most of the decisions. So changing them for that reason also makes sense. But in the case of the chairman, he's someone who has to be able to speak truth to power. He has to have backbone. He can't just be a yes man. I think that anybody that you boot out at this point is a good decision. You know, we're at the end of a long period of what I would call core rot in the Department of Defense. We've got large numbers of people at the top who have no business being there. They should never have been promoted to the ranks that they hold. The steady deterioration from excellence to mediocrity that I've been watching over the last 30 years is just astounding. And we have clearly bottomed out. So whatever Secretary Hegseth wants to change is good. I'm 100% behind it. The one criticism I would level is this. We don't want to rebuild anything, Dan. We want to build a new force. This is a strategic inflection point in the history of the United States. This is a time where we need to bring the forces back and we need to retread, reorganize, retrench. That means organize for a different war in the future and pay attention to our security here at home, principally the border with Mexico, but not just that, the borders, the coastal waters. You know, it's back to bring the Coast Guard back from the South China Sea. Ridiculous. Bring the Coast Guard back from the Indian Ocean. Ridiculous. Get focused on what really counts, and that's defense of our homeland. That has been ignored for far too long. You know, one of the things that Secretary Hegseth and the new Secretary of the Navy ought to do is bring in a snapshot from the satellites regarding where all the ships at sea are in the United States Navy, surface vessels and submarines. They can do that. And then look at what the picture was 30 years ago. And I've actually participated in this, and I can tell you that picture hasn't changed much. And the real question is why? You know, I listened to someone today that said, we have to build a much bigger Navy. Really? Is that the answer? A bigger version of what we have? We're not about to fight Jutland. We're not about to fight Midway. This is a new world. Are these big surface capital ships really what we want for the future? I don't think so. It's as dumb as the idea that we ought to organize the army to deploy to the Eurasian continent and fight against the Russians or the Chinese or somebody else. That's crazy. Those days are over. We're never going to get across those oceans. The submarines will sink us. Missiles will sink us. We don't have to have surface vessels all over the world because we have satellite-based surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence. We can find things out, but build a new force, and that can be done. Stop clinging tenaciously to the past. You know, there's this old expression from Peter Drucker. He said, people will always cling to the past and to the obsolete. They will never willingly march forward and adopt something new. The only way to get rid of the obsolete is to stop doing what you're doing. And there are lots of people in the Army that understand that. We're not going to refight the Second World War. We don't want to. And if we try to do it, particularly against the Russians, we'll be annihilated. You know, if you look at the density of force that was on the ground during World War II, as it faced against the Germans, if we try to do that again, we'll stand by and watch rocket artillery, medium-range ballistic missiles, glide bombs, you name it, fly in and obliterate everything. What are we doing? Cutting squares in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, waiting for what? It doesn't make any sense. We've got to sit down and take an honest look at ourselves. You know, the Marines have tried to do this. I think the outcome's been a disaster because there's also a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, we don't need any more of X. No, that's not necessarily true. We may not need as many of X. We may need fewer, but we're still going to need a lot of X. And, you know, the Marine Corps, the heart of the Marine Corps, the backbone is the infantry. We need the infantry. That infantry needs to be part of the larger ground force. It is in France. It is in Great Britain. It's vital and essential that we have access to Marine infantry to cooperate with us, not be treated as a second army, but be seen as an integral part of the larger ground force that can perform that infantry mission. Now, that may involve a new organization, new kinds of capabilities, weapon systems. We can sort through that. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, we don't need that anymore, or we're going to turn everybody into a rocketeer. We have lots of platforms, undersea, submersible, surface, and airborne, as well as ground-based, that can deliver missiles. We don't necessarily have to have large numbers of Marines spread out all over the Pacific Ocean, waiting for the evil Chinese empire to strike west. I mean, this is just crazy. The future is bright if we're willing to step back and look at things differently. And by the way, we may have to get smaller first. And everybody resists this. Well, we have to have X number of hundreds of thousands of troops or we're at risk. Wait a minute. Not necessarily. We're not facing imminent existential threats from Russia or China. That's a lot of malarkey. We know that's not true. Our problems are largely south of the border and inside our own country. Now, we can deal with those, but we need to build a really good professional army. And that army needs probably to become smaller. And once you make it clear that we're not going to send people on pointless missions to places in the world that have no chance whatsoever of ever developing into societies like our own, but are going to wallow for many, many years in confusion, which is, by the way, their right to do. They have a right to their own culture, a right to the way they live. It's not our business to influence that. If we can accept that and get out of this, then I think we can build a very fine professional force that can do all of the things that we really need. The other point is we got to get out of this business of assuming the future will look like the past. The Army generals cling to all of this overseas presence, just like the Navy, the Army, the Marines, and the Air Force. If they lose their overseas presence, then what do? Well, how about defend the United States of America? I can come up with a good rationale for 500,000 troops, most 90% of whom are here inside the United States. They may be organized differently, may be equipped differently, and be capable of different things. But we have problems here inside the country, and we have them on our borders. The Army has a role to play. We need to look at our Guard and Reserve, and they need to mirror, in many respects, the regular Army. We've lost touch with all of these things, and we've worn a lot of people out. We've driven a lot of talent out. We've got to sit down and get back to basics and understand that our borders need protection, and we may have to fight in our hemisphere, not just along the border, but in other places. That's different from what we've been doing. And the same thing holds true for the Marine Corps. But the notion that we should be prepared to go thousands of miles away from home and conduct campaigns on the scale of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or finally Desert Storm, and what we've seen over the last 20 years, is absolutely ludicrous. But the world is going to be different. And we've talked about that. We're talking about regional actors now coming to the fore. We see great power civilizations like Iran, India, China, roaring back into focus and playing a role in the world. We need to get out of this business of thinking that we are the indispensable power. We aren't. The only thing that's indispensable to us is what we do here at home. We need to think of ourselves in those terms and stop wasting money, resources, and capabilities elsewhere. And if we are going to have alliances in the future, and I'm one of these people that thinks we should have little, what I would call, LLCs, limited liability partnerships with other countries. In other words, let's cooperate for this purpose. When that purpose is at an end, the cooperation doesn't need to completely end, but it certainly should end in a military sense. And I think we have to back up from all of this and rethink what we're doing and who we are. It's very difficult because, the biggest problem, Dan, this will disrupt, if not end, the money flow. And how do you justify all these crazy things if you're not going to get any money for it? Well, you're not. And I think President Trump has already talked about that when he said we'll cut our defense budgets in half. Obviously, he doesn't realize how much less everybody spends than us. And the same thing is true with others. In other words, let's not fall into this trap that we've been in for so many years of trying to create these alliances that live on a hair trigger, designed to fight somebody somewhere. And then when they no longer have that mission, we try to breathe new life into the comatose body of the alliance like NATO, and then use it for our purposes someplace else. You remember, NATO's either out of area or out of business. Well, I don't think most of those Europeans wanted to go out of area at all. So what have we done to them? Nothing good. But I think the Doge crowd is going to find that out. I don't know how much will work because, again, first you have to change the strategy, then you build a new structure. This is the time for that. This is the ideal time in the history of mankind for us to do that. We don't want to miss it. I think President Trump can achieve that with the Chinese, particularly if it works with Moscow. I think that opportunity will present itself. Right now, people don't understand in the United States that most people beyond our borders want nothing to do with a war. They just don't. If you visit China, you visit Korea, visit Japan, and see the monumental buildings these people have created, the societies that they've created. They're very different from us, but they work. They're very good. They're very effective. They're not interested in putting all of that at risk. Anybody who thinks so is absolutely deranged.